Hello, welcome to the fanfic reread project. Today we are beginning our reread of The Dark Knight Rises. So, it doesn't really require much explanation. It is the sequel to both my Batman Begins and The Dark Knight fic. This one's probably the longest of the fanfics we will have read so far. Yet, unlike the previous two entries, this is not entirely done. And that is due to the fact that the last time I touched this document, I was in the middle of editing it and I stopped, and then I kicked this entire series out of my continuity and tried to start over with Batman. So this is notable because halfway through the story there is a very major editing cut, and then the story changes tone kind of drastically. I remember once I described it as the story just straight up changes genre about 2/3 of the way through due to the edits. But despite all of that, this is still a good almost 50,000 words long. It is still to this day the longest prose piece I've ever written. But yeah, so let's get right into it. We begin with a chapter from a mystery POV. I won't say because this is revealed at the end of the second chapter. So let's get into it. Night settled over Gotham City beautifully, and even more so over the Palisades. The dark purple sky glowed softly over the slowly waving waters of the river. From the lawns of Wayne Manor, the city sparkled like a jewel in the dark. She actually found herself admiring it as she glided through the crowd of Gotham's elite. She'd never seen it from this angle. I love that right off the back, I'm like, yep, we are right back in this series. The description of the purple sky, I don't know, that just really brought me back. Because that's such a huge thing in this series too, because one of the things that I really prided myself on back in the day was oh, I really observed my surroundings to make this super accurate, which means that basically one night I went with my stepmom and my dad and my stepsisters to go to a restaurant in Philly, and I looked up basically, but observation. So I based a lot of my descriptions of the sky especially off of that because I wanted it to be really authentic to what it looks like in the city at night. I really cared about the authenticity. But moving on. Mayor Garcia addressed the crowd from a podium that had been set up at the top of the lawn. Harvey Dent Day may not be our oldest public holiday, but we're here tonight because it's one of the most important. Harvey Dent's uncompromising stand against organized crime and, ultimately, his sacrifice has made Gotham a safer place than it was at the time of his death 4 years ago. This city has seen a historic turnaround. No city is without crime, but this city is without organized crime because the Dent Act gave law enforcement teeth in its fight against the mob. Now people are talking about repealing the Dent Act, and to them I say, not on my watch. That line got uproarious applause. I want to thank the Wayne Foundation for hosting this event. I'm told Mr. Wayne couldn't be here with us tonight, but I'm sure he's here in spirit. Funny how Wayne couldn't even come to one of these things held at his own house, she thought as she waded through the sea of people. Ever lay eyes on Wayne at one of these things, she heard someone say, echoing her thoughts. She slowed a bit. So let me pause right here before we get into this next conversation. Because I did want to note, I arrange these podcasts so you can get a somewhat clear progression of my writing. However, there are some things that I can't avoid, and that is the fact that some of these stories were edited after the fact, but much like this, the edits were never finished. So, The Dark Knight Rises, the last time I edited it was almost a year after I had initially finished it. So while the back part of the story has edits from only about 2013 and not that long after it was written, the first part of the story, which I think covers roughly half of it, was edited in 2014 and quite heavily. So you will see some change in the writing style between the two. I just wanted to note that because so far this has been, compared to Batman Begins, this has been very clear and easy to read, not a lot of run-on sentences. And even though it has some of the quirks, details and stuff from the stories back then, the actual writing quirks have been few and far between. I know it might be well, you just started, how can you tell? But trust me, writing from this period tends to give itself away very quickly. So I just wanted to put that out there for when we actually do get to that editing split and you can see the differences more clearly. So, ever lay eyes on Wayne at one of these things, she heard someone say, echoing her thoughts. She slowed a bit. That kind of makes the POV character's thoughts kind of redundant though, doesn't it? But anyway. No one has, another man answered, not in years. The voice was a bit familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She took a turn and they were right in her sights. All right, there we go. That's something that makes me feel like I'm reading something from 2013. The familiar voice had come from Deputy Commissioner Foley, she recognized now, a tall blond man in his dress blues. The other must have come from Congressman Gilly, an older man who looked like he drank too much. How does one look like you drink too much? Is he drunk right now? Also, sorry about the bug noises. It's really cool outside, but it's like almost the middle of July, so I'm not closing my window because I need to save power. But anyway. The police commissioner was there too, but he was absorbed in a small stack of papers in his hand. He always looked so tired, she thought as she started to pass them. Hey, sweetheart, not so fast with the chow. She bit her lip as she felt someone pinch her ass. She turned and held out the tray. Shrimp ball? She asked demurely. The congressman took two with a wicked smile on his face. Both of the commissioners were looking at him uncomfortably. She kept an ear on their conversation as she inched away. Take it easy, she heard Foley say. At least some of them had tact. Gilly didn't seem to pay him any mind. Jesus, Gordon, is that your speech? We'll be here all night. Maybe the truth about Harvey isn't so simple, Congressman. He sounded troubled. Odd. She decided to tune back into the mayor. So, before we go on, this opening is, I think, in the actual source material, it is character introduction to Gilly, and he's kind of gross, but Foley's just kind of like there. It's more exposition, establishing like, oh yeah, Bruce Wayne hasn't been here in like a really long time, but I feel like this is actually a somewhat decent character introduction to Foley, especially because we've never seen him as well as Gilly, though. I will say that having Gilly like sexually harass someone to establish the fact that he's really gross is kind of lazy, but that's what happened in the movie, so I did it too. So moving on. She decided to tune back into the mayor. Now I'm going to give way to an important voice. He can tell you about the old days, when the criminals and corrupt ran this town with such a tight grasp that people put their faith in a murderous thug in a cape, a thug who showed his true nature when he betrayed the trust of this great man and murdered him in cold blood. But I'll let him tell you himself. Commissioner Gordon. So, I think right now we are running into one of the big issues with the Dark Knight not being written in full. Yes, we know that Harvey died in the movie, but there has to be some kind of changes that happened because of that, even just because the characters are different. And I feel like instead of using the mayor's speech to establish all this stuff and be like, yes, it definitely happened, just show the people that it happened. And then keep this stuff as a very necessary reference. It just kind of is weird. Another thing, strange of the mayor to say that Gordon can quote unquote tell you about the old days when I actually shortened the gap between The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises to 4 years. So it wasn't that long ago. Like, it's not like, hey, ye olden days. 8 years, yes, it may not seem like much more than 4, but there's a difference, a big difference between like someone who was born when The Dark Knight ended being in preschool and someone who was born when The Dark Knight ended being in like 3rd grade. It's a very big difference, you know? So that line would have made more sense if the gap had been longer. However, I had a reason for shortening the gap. I might not get into that right now. We can talk about it at the end of this chapter. The crowd gave an inspired round of applause as Gordon made his way to the stage. He let his eyes wander over the crowd before he began. Repetition. I missed the... The truth, he started in a weary voice. He looked down at his papers. I've written a speech telling the truth about Harvey Dent. He paused and looked out over the crowd again, but maybe the time isn't right. He folded the papers and tucked them into his jacket. Maybe all you need to know is that there are thousands of inmates in Blackgate Prison as a direct result of the Dent Act. These are violent criminals, essential cogs in the organized crime machine that terrorized Gotham for so long. Maybe, for now, all I should say about Harvey Dent's death is that it hasn't been for nothing. The crowd gave another round of applause as he left. Let me pause here again. I guess this is more a critique of the source material, so I'll keep it short. But it's very strange to me that people keep talking about, like, oh, the Dent Act gave the law enforcement teeth against the mob, when the problem is not that they couldn't just prosecute the mob because the mob was, like, almighty. It was because the mob was paying off cops. Like, I feel like we're kind of missing the point, that this is not something a law really should have been able to fix that easily. Because the whole point in The Dark Knight is that Gordon was the one guy who was willing to prosecute the mob because he was the one guy who wasn't on anyone's payroll. And this is something we actually did see a bit of during Batman Begins. Not necessarily like the mob using their police connects, but the fact that like Flass was clearly working on the side for Carmine Falcone. And like the whole reason that Falcone is able to get away with doing clearly illegal things that like all of the cops know about is that most of the cops are being paid by him. So they don't care. They don't go after him. That's not an issue of like, they probably do have laws in place that say, well, you can't do that illegally. But because half of the police aren't willing to actually prosecute him, they can't do anything, and then he can worm his way out of things because he's paid off judges. If you find the evidence that it's happening, you can get these people arrested anyway. Like, I think it's also hard coming again back to this because of Daredevil. Like, if you watch even the source material of that, the reason why Fisk got taken down and why they were able to arrest the police and all of the people that were working with him, because he had like state senators who were being paid off by him. But they were able to arrest them because they got evidence from someone who collaborated with them that all of this shit was happening, and they arrested all the people and they were gathering more of the evidence and stuff. It's not a matter of, well, they needed someone to ratify a law to take them down. Like, this is just very confusing. But let's keep going. She rounded back toward the house, but slowed when she passed the commissioners again. Gordon reached them just then. Well, how does she pass the commissioners slightly before, like, that's weird. Anyway, the second shift reports in, he said to Foley. On your desk. Maybe you should put in some more time with the mayor. That's your department. Gordon turned from him to move towards the drive. She started forward again once Gordon was gone. Anyone shown him the crime stats? The congressman said to Foley. He goes by his gut, and it continues to bother him, whatever the numbers, Foley answered. Must be popular with the wife, the congressman said after taking a swallow. She cringed internally. Not really, Foley said, looking down. She took the kids and moved to Cleveland. Well, he'll have plenty of time for visits. Mayor's dumping him in the spring. Really? He's a hero. He's a war hero. This is peacetime. Stay sharp, Gilly said, patting him on the shoulder. The job is yours. Foley left Gilly for the mayor, and she left the crowd for the mansion. I keep wondering how this girl is like moving through the crowd in such a way that they can't see her, but she can clearly hear everything that's happening. Anyway, the stainless steel of the kitchen echoed with the clatter of utensils and the chatter of voices. Sure. For the residents, it was absolutely huge, but she shouldn't have expected any less, again, with the absolutely's. Like I said, there are plenty of things that do mark this, but we managed to stay away from that stuff for like a page, so I'm giving it that. She sat down her tray and moved to one of the counters to help the other maids. They were gossiping about the same thing they were when she left, Mr. Wayne. They say he never leaves the West Wing, one of them said. I heard he had an accident, that he's disfigured, another said. It seemed like he was the thing on everyone's minds tonight. It made sense, seeing how the man just up and disappeared off the face of the earth a couple of years ago. See, again, this is really weird. Yes, it is strange that no one's seen him, but it's also only been 2 years. In the movie, it had been, I think, maybe 4 or more years since then, so it's kind of like, the fuck happened to that guy, you know? A third maid shushed them as Mr. Pennyworth entered. The whole kitchen seemed to get a bit quieter. I think it's also a bit weird for them to go over this when Bruce Wayne also disappeared off of the face of the earth for 7 years at a time once. I'm surprised that people are surprised. They'd be like, oh, maybe this is his kind of thing, you know? Anyway, Mr. Till, why are your people using the main stairs? Mr. Pennyworth asked in his posh accent. Mr. Till apologized profusely. Everyone else kept themselves busy and acted like they weren't listening. Mr. Pennyworth moved to the counter she was at and placed a glass of water on a tray with a covered dish. Where's Mrs. Bolton? She's up at the bar, sir, she said to him. Can I help? He took a large and old-looking key from his pocket and placed it on the tray. Take this to the east drawing room. Unlock the door, place the tray on the table, and lock the door. Nothing more. She could feel the other girls looking at her as she nodded and took the tray from the counter. I know my Alfred sounds different, but, yep, it just sounds different. Sorry about that. I'll try to get it back to normal. The massive corridors of the manse were deathly quiet as she made her way to the main floor. She moved through halls with walls in white and tan and gold and orange, the floors all sparkling marble or polished hardwood. It had a warm feel that made the emptiness feel more jarring. She let her heels hit the floor harder than she ought to have, but the sound didn't make it any better. The echoing only worked to unnerve her further. How could he live alone in this place? So can we talk about this character and her? This is something that actually comes up a few times when this character is alone in sort of like a kind of large and empty space. She will walk very hard and tap her heels just to hear the noise, but I can't see any situation where that would be at all comforting, honestly. But anyway, so see here that I hope I talked about this when we did Batman Begins. But see here that the color coding has come back in full force, with Wayne Manor being all of the colors that we're used to, and we'll see it again when we get to this character's later chapters, and she goes to a fancy party, and we'll see the other side of it, the silver and white part. She quieted herself as she wound her way up the main staircase, letting her hand brush the painted iron handrails every so often. She set foot on yet another landing when she heard voices and stopped short. She could just see Mr. Pennyworth up the flight of stairs ahead of her, speaking to someone concealed by the wall. "I'm sorry, Miss Tate, but I've tried. He won't see you." "It's important, Mr. Pennyworth." It sounded like a woman, and she had a thick accent that might have been French, but she wasn't entirely sure. If you're in a situation where you hear someone refer to someone as Miss, would you not assume they were a woman? Maybe this character's like super woke or something. IDK. Moving on. "Mr. Wayne isn't taking any visitors tonight," Pennyworth responded. There was a distant sound of a door opening, and then he added, "except family." Her eyes widened as she saw Tony Stark round the corner and make his way down the stairs toward her. She looked down shyly as he passed her. Family isn't exactly the word she would have used. Ha 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 ha. Why does everyone know about that? What the heck? Anyway, she decided that then was the time to make her way up the stairs so that she wouldn't raise any suspicions. She moved quietly, but just as she did, a third person spoke. "Don't take it personally, Miranda." She recognized that one immediately, and she stepped on the landing just as Mr. Daggett stepped up to them, the little slimeball that he was. Miss Tate turned out to be an elegant-looking woman in a purple dress that stood out against her pale skin. She started in the opposite direction. "Everyone knows that Wayne is holed up in there with 8-inch nails pissing in the mason jars," he said to them. She glanced back and saw the glib smile on his face. "Good of you to let me on the grounds. The Dent Act is about all Gotham," Mr. Pennyworth said. "Even you, Mr. Daggett. Miss Tate, always a pleasure." She heard Mr. Pennyworth move down the stairs. She stopped and moved herself behind a side table holding an elaborate vase. Wouldn't it have made more sense for her to go around the corner and hide behind the wall? "Why waste your time trying to talk to the man who threw away your investment on some save-the-world vanity project?" Daggett said to Miss Tate. "He can't help you get your money back, but I can." Miss Tate chuckled. "I could try explaining that a save-the-world project, vain or not, is worth investing in. I could try, Mr. Daggett, but you only understand money and the power you think it buys you, so why waste my time indeed?" She heard her heels click down toward the stairs. She noticed that Daggett had noticed her, and she continued on her way. "See, that's what I mean. Hide behind the wall. Make your way down the hall and then turn down another and then hide behind the wall." She made her way down that hall and then turned down another before she found the heavy oak door with the doorknob that matched her key. She pushed the key into the lock and the door opened at her touch with a light creak. She entered a room, small for this house, with white walls framed with gold trim. A single table stood in the middle, round and made of rich dark wood. She sat the tray down and picked up the key again. There was a rectangle of light on the floor from a door on the wall that stood slightly ajar. She smiled. And that is the end of that chapter. Oh, God, I said I was going to talk about something at the end of the chapter, but... Oh! The reason why the 4-year gap happens. So, let me tell you. So, this chapter, so far, it's fine. It is definitely better than some of the stuff that we've read in Batman Begins, but it is not, the best thing in the world. It's not, stellar or anything. It's fine. It's passable. It does what it needs to do, and it's definitely an improvement. I think that's what matters the most here. But before we go on to the next chapter... To talk briefly about that 4-year gap, the reason why I shortened the gap is because this story clearly, as you can tell from the Tony Stark cameos, takes place in the same world as some MCU-based stories. So the Avengers happens after this story, and I didn't want this story to happen after the Avengers, because then Batman would be out of commission. Now, it's really weird because the way that this goes, it kind of doesn't make sense. Oh, you know what? There's another reason why I didn't want this to happen after the Avengers, and it had to do with Tony. But it is weird because I think, it kind of goes back to the idea that, well, if Batman's out of commission, then he can't help. But Batman wasn't supposed to be in the Avengers anyway, because he purposefully, as you'll see at the end of the story, he purposefully sits out becoming part of the Avengers initiative because he was worried that Ra's al Ghul was going to come back to Gotham and he didn't want to leave while that guy was still kind of like floating around, you know? But the other thing is that if this story took 8 years, and The Dark Knight Rises takes place in 2008, so this story starts in 2012 and then goes into 13. The Avengers, I think, was supposed to happen that summer. So this story begins October of 2012, which this story takes like 7 chapters to actually say, and ends in May. And the Avengers would then happen either June or July or something like that. So with that, if this had happened significantly after the Avengers, Iron Man would have happened in the space between when Dark Knight ends and when this story begins, meaning that there would be no excuse for Tony not being in the story. So I needed a reason to exclude him from this, even though it doesn't make any fucking sense, even if he is an Iron Man, so that I could just have Bruce sort of figure things out on his own and go for it, you know? So I think that was the main reason why, because if this happened, not only would Iron Man exist, the Avengers would exist, so wouldn't they be able to just call in the Avengers and kind of like, this would not even be a thing? I think that's the real actual reason why I shortened the gap, which makes sense, to be honest. It's not just about keeping Tony out, it's about making sure the story can actually happen the way that it needs to. Though I'm still a big advocate for Tony having been in the story more than he was. That's the last time we're going to see him in this, which is criminal. But anyway, so next chapter, also from the POV of this mystery girl. The room on the other side of the door was bigger and filled with furniture, more so than any of the other rooms she'd seen. It was beautiful, all upholstered in gold and trimmed with polished wood and bronze. The floor lamps were just as nice and covered with silky golden lampshades. A soft breeze blew in from an open window along a wall of them, all their wooden frames painted brown. Why wouldn't they? It's wood. Wood's brown. Most wood is brown anyway. Why didn't they just make it dark brown wood? That's weird. I need to not get into the particulars of the Wayne's interior decorating choices. She ran a hand along a side table that sat against the wall. A couple of photos sat on its surface. There was one of a pretty girl with blue eyes and brown hair, who she realized was the former assistant DA before her accident, and another of a pregnant couple standing in a garden. She was beautiful, with dark brown hair that waved down over her shoulders. He looked like the few pictures of Mr. Wayne that she'd seen, but thinner, with lighter hair and wearing a pantsuit. They had to be his parents. There were other things, too. Some furniture covered with sheets, a telescope that made her a bit wary, and an archery target that hung from the front of an old bureau. 2 big black arrows stuck out from the bullseye. She let her hand run across one of them. Thwack! The arrow stuck right into the bullseye, not even an inch from where her hand had been before it flew to her mouth. She whipped around to find Mr. Wayne staring back at her with the bow in his hands. He looked like he hadn't been out of the house all day, though the embroidered silk robe he was wearing looked more elaborate than any gown she'd ever owned. He picked up his cane off the ground and leaned his long frame against it. She was actually shocked. No one had ever snuck up on her before. "I'm terribly, terribly sorry, Mr. Wayne," she started, stumbling over her words. It is Mr. Wayne, right?" He nodded. "Although you don't have the long nails or the facial scars." She let out a nervous laugh. "Is that what they say about me?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "It's just that nobody ever sees you." He moved toward her. "That's a beautiful necklace," he said. Her hand went to the string of pearls around her neck, glowing olive green in the soft lights. "It reminds me of the one that belonged to my mother. They're very rare." She blushed. "They were a gift." Hers were too. They couldn't possibly be the same ones, though, because her pearls are in this safe, he said as he moved to the side table. He pressed his cane into something on the table, and the doors underneath it opened to reveal a safe, its door left ajar. "The manufacturer clearly explained to me that it's uncrackable." She looked down at the ground. "Oops," and then dropped the act. "No one told me it was uncrackable." He smiled despite that. "I'm afraid I can't let you take those." She strode towards him. "Look, you wouldn't hit a woman any more than I would beat up a cripple." She kicked his cane from under him, and he went crashing to the ground. "But sometimes exceptions have to be made." She hopped up on the side table and then climbed into the window. "Good night, Mr. Wayne." She flipped backwards and landed outside, right on her feet. As she moved toward the drive, she ripped her collar and cuffs off, leaving only the little black dress underneath. One of the valet boys hurried and opened the door to a town car for her. She smiled at him and slipped inside. Congressman Gilly was in the seat next to her, his white skin flushed red. "Can I have a ride?" she asked sweetly. He grinned. "You read my mind." Selena's stomach turned, but she smiled back. And that's the end of that chapter. I stand by my assertion that that chapter should have been Bruce's introduction. But for what it is, I guess it does what it needs to do. It feels pointless though, because it's so short that you could have just appended it to the last chapter and left it at that, you know? I know the reason why I kept the chapter break is because I didn't want the audience to see Selena stealing the pearls. Another really good way to avoid that would have been having this chapter set from another character's POV, perhaps, you know, our main character. Like, it's just weird because, number one, we could have had a bigger Tony cameo if we had Selena go into the room and she opens the door, sets the thing down, sees the room, and then we end it with Selena smiled. And it's like, oh, wow, it was Selena Kyle the whole time. Then we rewind the clocks a little bit and see what Bruce was talking to Tony about and then go from there, you know, and we see those same like similar scenes from his point of view. I think that could have been really interesting because we could have learned what he's been up to for these last 4 years at the beginning of the story. And it especially works because it's literally like it would have been Selena and then Bruce and then our third POV character in the edited version. The fourth character isn't introduced until later. We'll talk about him when we get to him because his chapters are arranged a little bit confusingly, but yeah, so it was fine, but it definitely, I still feel like it should have been Bruce's POV. So let's move on. I'm gonna try and read the next two too, so we can cover all of our POV characters at the start. So the next chapter is from the POV of John Blake, but there are some changes to the John Blake character, so let's jump right in so you can see those. John put her head in her hands as she leaned against the front counter. In the bluish lights of the MCU, her cream-colored skin looked ceaseous and pale, which is just about how she felt considering the hour. It was too warm, too, she thought as she smoothed her bangs back down. Tonight wasn't the best of nights, which was odd since they didn't do much around here anyway. Maybe it was just her. Maybe she was thinking too much. Okay, so right away, John Blake is a woman in this. I question my choice to have her still be named John. Like, I guess it's not the weirdest thing, but it also is a little bit kind of like strange. It's especially weird because we learn later that John's full name is Joanna. So why not Joe Blake if we wanted to keep like the sort of like gender neutral name in it? It's just kind of strange. Hey guys, editing Frankie here. I kind of forgot to mention that the reason why John Blake's name still being John, even though her full name is Joanna, is actually weird, is because in the story, John Blake is supposed to be trans. Now, there's no point in the story where this is conveyed at all, but I did write the character with that intention. Now, sure, you can be trans and be named John and be a woman. People's names are their business. But the issue is that this is a fictional character that I, a person who is not trans, am writing. And having the character be named John when her first name doesn't really shorten to that, there are just some really weird implications about why she's called John that I really don't like. I wish I had mentioned that here because I did eventually mention that at a point during this reread, but it wasn't for another like 5 or 6 episodes. But either way, that's the reason why it's weird. It's because of the implication that John is a nickname that comes from her dead name. Because it doesn't quite match up with her actual name. You know what I mean? And that's why it bothers me. All right, now let's get back to the review. She looked up at the sound of someone ascending the stairs. Yo, Rose said, tapping her on the back. They want you to go get Gordon. The girl wasn't looking too hot either. Congressman Gilly's wife's been calling. Said he never came home after that Wayne Foundation thing that was tonight. John squinted at her, but then nodded. Rose started for the door, but then stopped, came back and smoothed her bangs back down. Why do they always do that? I don't know, John said as she swatted her hand away. Go home. Rose smiled. So it's nice that we're introducing that Rose and John are friends. I think her smoothing down John's bangs is actually like, that totally is a good like friend moment. However, Rose's introduction does make this chapter feel a little bit redundant. Again, I think this is another good example of me not really understanding cop tings because John's literally just like sitting around. And I do understand you could use this to exemplify the fact that like nothing is really going on. But like John doesn't even just like filling out useless paperwork or something. She's just standing there. It's kind of weird. Moving on. She made her way up the stairs and to the roof. The light of the city made the purple sky glow above the towering skyscrapers. She removed her jacket as a breeze blew through the cooler air, and she brushed her hair down on impulse. The change in scenery felt nice. No wonder Gordon always came up here. She found him sitting next to the old broken searchlight with a large stack of files. Sir, she said quietly, I didn't want to bother you up here, but they're looking for you downstairs. He took a bit to tear his eyes from the papers in his hands. Oh, what's the problem? Congressman Gilly's wife has been calling. He hasn't made it home from the Wayne Foundation event yet. That's a job for the police, he said, raising an eyebrow. Sir, when you and Dent cleaned up the streets, you cleaned them up good. Pretty soon we'll be chasing overdue library books. Gordon smiled. John eyed the stack of files next to him on the vent. But here you are, like we're still at war. He shrugged. Old habits. Our instinct. Gordon gave her a look. What's your name? Blake, sir. He rose from his place on the ground. You have something you want to ask me, Officer Blake? Yeah. Why isn't Dent Day on the day that he, actually died? There was always something about that put her off. They didn't want trouble, he told her. People get crazy on Halloween. Is that all? She whistled. It's about that night. The Batman murders those people, takes down 2 SWAT teams, breaks Dent's neck, and then just vanishes. I'm not hearing a question. John shrugged. Don't you want to know what happened to him after that? I do know, he answered, gazing at the searchlight. They chased him out. I watched them do it. He sighed. It doesn't matter now anyway. He's not coming back. Gordon brushed past her toward the stairs. Let's go see about the congressman's wife. And that's the end of that chapter. I feel like John's question about why Dent Day isn't on the day that Harvey Dent actually died is a little bit weird. I feel like she could have explained that to us in her thing, because it's really like in the middle of this dramatic moment where Gordon's like, you want to ask me a question? And then it really seems like John is about to ask about that day. And then it's like, skirt! How come it's not on the day that he died? Like, it's really weird. So I feel like just giving her the prior knowledge of, oh, the Dent Day is today, but it's weird because he died on Halloween, but I guess there's already a holiday on Halloween, so, But overall, I mean, this chapter was I feel like we're going to run into this issue again where the police character has the most lackluster chapters. I find John more compelling than Gordon was in Batman Begins, and John does have some good chapters down the line, but getting to those takes a little bit of time. But for what it is fine. It's passable. So, moving on to the last chapter I'm going to read for this episode. We're finally back to Bruce. Him here. It felt like it had been ages since he'd been in the cave. It had only been 3 years, but since he'd taken off the suit for the last time, it felt like there were more hours in the day. 3 years. So does that mean that the mansion was finished being built the year that the Dark Knight happened? I don't know. After the events of the night before, he got himself down there after he finally rolled out of bed. He slept later than he usually did, which in and of itself was a feat since he usually slept till noon. I like that, again, this is a consistent thing with Bruce that shows up in all 3 stories, is that he apparently just cannot wake up before like 11 o'clock. That doesn't seem normal, but alright. Foreshadowing. Bruce hadn't even put on real clothes before he came down there and had worried that he might be cold for about a second before he just decided that he would suck it up if it was. Wow, run-on sentence, back with a goddamn vengeance. Good lord. He was met by a surprising amount of warmth. He'd put the computer where his old work table had been and next to the cabinet where he kept the old bat suit. It almost felt like the old days being in that spot again. It wasn't until he sat down that he realized that he hadn't put on shoes either. Oh, that's definitely normal. Do you know that I actually sat down and looked up whether Bruce could go in the cave without shoes on in the middle of the fall? I literally Wikipedia'd this and learned that caves actually do stay a little bit warm in the fall and winter, which is why bats stay in the caves during that time of the year, but during the summer and stuff, they roost in houses sometimes because it's still warm down there. I looked this up. Why? He didn't turn when he heard Alfred approach. You haven't been down here in a while, he said. Bruce nodded absently. I was trying to find out more about our jewel thief. I ran her prints from the photos she handled. He pushed a key and the photo of a fat, bald man came up on the screen, but she was wearing someone else's prints. She's good. How did she do that? How does one do that? I don't know. I'm not a spy. She may be, Alfred agreed, but we have the trace on the necklace. He placed a tray next to him with lunch, and Bruce absently reached for his food, mumbling a thank you before he spoke again. I cross-referenced the address she went back to with police data on high-end B&Es. He messed with the keyboard again, and the picture changed to the maid, a light-skinned girl with big brown eyes. In her mugshot, her long brown hair hadn't been straightened like he'd seen before, instead being in a pair of French braids. Selena Kyle. The databases are full of close calls, tips from fences. She's good, he said, eyeing the various newspaper headlines that covered the screens, but the ground is shrinking beneath her feet. I think Selena is not the first character because there are other characters who clearly aren't white, like Officer Roberts. I think Batman Begins came straight out and said that Commissioner Loeb was black, so there's that. But I think Selena is the first person where the race isn't explicitly said, but it is very clear that this person is not white. More so to that, to me, it does come across very clearly that she is black. I think it's because she's described as like light skinned, and then it's like, well, her hair wasn't straightened and it had been braided back. And then I'm like, I see. Which, to be honest, that could be anyone. But the thing is, you don't describe white people as light skinned. That's something you really only use for people of color. And then, well, the fact that her hair isn't straight that she could be any non-white race, but it is very clear that she is not white because, again, like, no one describes, at least people of color that I know, none of them describe white people as light-skinned. They're pale or white or other words that mean white or pale. But anyway, we should send the police before she fences the pearls, Alfred said. She won't. She likes them too much, and they weren't what she was after anyway. Oh, what was she after? My fingerprints. There was printer toner mixed with graphite on the safe. It gives you a good pull, and it's untraceable. Fascinating, Alfred said with mock amusement. Perhaps you two should trade notes over coffee. Bruce raised an eyebrow, unamused. Now you're trying to set me up with a jewel thief. At this point, sir, I'd set you up with a chimpanzee if I thought it would bring you back to the world. There's nothing out there for me, he scoffed. And that's the problem. You hung up your cape and cowl, but you never moved on. You won't get out there and find a life. Find someone. If I wanted someone, I'd be married already, Alfred, he said, and I had a life. You call that a life, sir? Spending your nights beating on criminals? And I assume now you're just waiting for things to go bad again so you can get back to quote-unquote living? Bruce didn't answer. Remember when you left Gotham? Before all this? Before Batman? 7 years you were gone. 7 years I waited, hoping you wouldn't come back. He looked up at him in surprise. Alfred sighed sadly. This place was nothing but a poison to you. I knew there was nothing here for you but pain and tragedy, and I wanted more than that for you. I still do. And that is the end of that chapter. Again, cannot say enough that I think that this should not have been Bruce's first chapter because it sends us right into this Alfred thing too quickly. It just comes up like super like, whoa, we're already getting into the shit. I feel like if Bruce had been introduced in any other chapter and him and Alfred had just a little chat about like Miranda coming and Alfred being like, I'm getting tired of constantly turning her away, and Bruce being like, whatever, Alfred. We could have like got into that part of the story a little bit early and then this stuff. Of course, another way to do that is to kind of like have Alfred kind of like chill, and maybe it just comes too early anyway. But yeah, for what it is, this chapter is all right. It's not the most interesting chapter. I will say that, to be honest, I think Bruce, up until you like start digging into his character arc, those moments are actually really interesting. But sometimes Bruce is the least interesting person in the story. Which is really sad because he is the main character. But again, I do find the aspect of his character arc regarding his relationships, like romantically speaking, to actually be like very interesting and pretty well done. You know what? Because there's actually more time than I thought there was, I'm going to read another chapter. So we go back to John here. And then this will be the last chapter we read because the next few chapters need to be read in sequence. The sun was only just starting to make its way into the sky when they got called out there and hadn't had a chance to warm the air around them. They said there was a boy who'd washed up in one of the outflows from the storm drain systems. She'd heard about this stuff before. It was one of the only serious things that came to the precinct anymore, but they'd never gotten her and Rose on it. The WDP man walked them along the concrete canal that separated them from the grates to the catchment basins. They wash up a couple of times a month, he said to her, more when it gets colder, homeless sheltering in the tunnels. We had to pull them clear of the basin, but other than that, we haven't touched them. This is my thing. There are times where the inner monologue will outline what is going on, and then a character will basically have dialogue that says exactly the same thing, and it's like, why not alter the dialogue so that the character doesn't have to say that and make the readers read that twice? Number 2, I feel like DWP should have been written out because I don't even know what that stands for. But I'm assuming it has something to do with like water, something like that. Drainage and water, papartment, I don't know. Papartment. You know those papartments that they have down at the government. The boy was a sad sight to see, his ochre skin ashen and starting to blue. His sopping wet clothes were threadbare, and the coat he wore didn't look like it could have kept him too warm. He was a teenager, but he hadn't fully grown into himself yet. What hit her was that the boy looked very familiar, like she'd seen him, but maybe when he was younger. She stepped forward to get a better look at his face. She cursed under her breath when she did. Rose looked at her. What? His name was Jimmy. He was at we'll just call it St. Swithin's. He was at St. Swithin's. Rose raised an eyebrow. It's the home where She trailed off, but immediately wiped the look off her face. Rose noticed anyway. Come on, I'll call it in. John was silent in the car as she mulled over her thoughts. What the hell was he doing down there? Homeless sheltering in the sewers, he'd said, but he wasn't homeless. She knew that. What's St. Swithin's? Rose asked her. It's an orphanage in Midtown. And how do you know he was there? I was there. She saw Rose give her a look. I mean, he was little when I was there, but I still recognize him. Rose squinted. You never told me that before. It never came up, she said with a shrug. It wasn't a complete lie, but in reality, she just didn't like to talk about it much. She was the only one of her siblings who had come back to Gotham as it was. You know what? Take me there. I'll tell you the way. Pause, because this kid is like 16, right? Or something like that. Yeah, he's got to be about 16. And he has a little brother. I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to think of how long it has been since John would have been in this orphanage. Also, aren't orphanages not a thing anymore? I don't know. But the point being that I guess he would have been really little when John was there, 6 or something, if John was there 10 years ago. I think it's also, I'm not entirely sure how old John is, but John has to be knocking on 30's door, if not 30 already, because even rookie police officers usually aren't that young. I don't know why, but they usually aren't. So she has to be in her late 20's or 30 or something like that at the oldest, or at the youngest, I should say. It's in the story, so it doesn't matter. But anyway. They pulled up to an old building with chalky white siding and wooden sills covered in peeling paint. It was technically in the Narrows, but it also wasn't. Don't wait around for me, she said as she got out of the car. I'll be a bit. How are you technically in the Narrows, but you aren't? Okay, so here's the thing. Did we ever get into the description of the way Gotham City is kind of laid out in Batman Begins? I don't know if we did. Because Gotham City is a little bit confusing with the way that, because you have uptown Gotham, which I think is the one of the ritzier areas of Gotham at the very north of the island. And then downtown Gotham technically is the area with all of the skyscrapers that is directly south of that. After that is Midtown, which is in the middle of the island. And then separating Midtown from the poorer districts on the southern side of the island is what's called the gray zone, which is technically Midtown. But it's really the poorer part of Midtown. Midtown is where all the middle class people live, basically. And then from there on south, it's a collection of neighborhoods like the Narrows and whatever the fuck Sterling Projects is. I mean, it's projects. And I think Little Italy is also down there. Chinatown is further south, and Old City. All of these places that are more lower income are on the southern side of the island. So you can't really be in the Narrows and not be in the Narrows, because there is a distinct two neighborhoods. And I think she said St. Swithin's is an orphanage in Midtown, which means that it's definitely not in the unless it's in the gray zone. I guess technically that could be the Narrows, but I think there's also a big distinction between what is and isn't the Narrows, because the Narrows is kind of fucking trash. Meaning that it's literally falling apart, whereas most of Midtown is even if it's kind of old, it's still standing. But anyway, the home was just the way she remembered it. Cracks ran through the wood of the stairwell that she climbed after she entered through the front doors. Kids ran up and down the halls, eliciting shouts of warning and caution from the sisters and other guardians. The iron crosses hung from the wall, with the silver stars in the middles and the ceramic wings on the sides. That sentence was constructed so badly. Just say iron crosses hung from the walls with silver stars in the middles. I don't know why all those thes are there. John knocked on lightly an upstairs door. What? John knocked lightly on an upstairs door, and the Mother Superior beckoned her in. There were more lines in her salt white skin now. She invited her to sit, but John declined. What is it, child? She said, noticing the look of distress on her face. I got a call about the body of a teenage boy that washed out from the sewers. You think he was one of ours? I know he was. James Harlow. Mother Anita closed her eyes and nodded. What was he doing down there? I don't know. Jimmy hasn't been here for months, she answered. Why? He aged out. We don't have the resources to keep them on after 16. You know that, Joanna. The Wayne Foundation gives money for that. Not for 2 years now. That was strange. Still had enough money to put on nice parties. He has a brother here, right? She nodded. Mark, I'll tell him. I'd like to, if that's all right. She nodded again. Okay, so the pronoun game got really confusing there. But again, like I said, John's full name is Joanna. Why is her nickname not just Joe? I feel like it was sort of an effort to give the character the same name, because this is not the first time that I've done this, changed the character's gender, but then gave them some way to give them the same name. The other time it happened is in The Fall, which you can actually read with Phil Coulson, who is a woman in that. But however, Phil is called Phil because her actual name is Philippa. So it kind of makes sense. Like, yeah, it might be weird to call a girl Phil, but given the situation in that her name is literally Philippa, it's like, okay, that's a short name for Phil, whatever, you know. But in John's case, I feel like it comes across as a little bit more contrived because her name doesn't shorten to John. I don't know. But anyway, John could see the mother watching them from the door as she sat on the roof. Mark looked so much like his brother, but obviously smaller and with a rounder face. It seemed like he'd taken the news well, but then she realized that he seemed distracted. He spoke absent-mindedly as he drew something onto the asphalt with chalk. What was he doing down in the tunnels? John asked him quietly. A lot of guys been going down there when they age out. They say you can live down there. Say there's work down there. She raised an eyebrow. What kind of work are you going to find in the sewers? More than you can find up here, I guess. John looked down. That wasn't good. Mark finally turned to look up at her. Do you think he's coming back? Who? The Batman? I don't know. Mark turned away from her and went back to his scribbling. She looked over him to see what he was drawing. 8 little bats, all in a circle. All right, so that is the end of that chapter. In this case, it does seem kind of weird that Mark's little question about the Batman, like, it does kind of come out of nowhere, but that's on purpose. So I'm totally will overlook it because that's supposed to be there. And you will see why a little bit further down the line. We get further into the story and more things sort of flesh out why this moment happens. This chapter wasn't bad. I don't like it, but it wasn't bad. Like, it does what it needs to do. I do like that this story tells us quite a bit about John's backstory, because that's nice. I'm kind of like back and forth, because again, I'm not really fond of this chapter, but it does do some decent things, so hey. And we also got some pretty decent world building in this with the mentions of like St. Swithin's and where it is and like the whole idea of like Midtown and stuff, because this is a story where Gotham, like the configuration of the neighborhoods in Gotham, is really fleshed out. Batman Begins gives you little tidbits about it, but you don't really see all that much. We'll get more of that in the next chapter and next episode, so like I said, I'm gonna end that here. Overall chapters we read today, I shouldn't do this, but they were all right. I remember back in the day, I used to get excited to read this story, but now I'm just kind of like, eh. It's definitely better than Batman Begins. So far it has been, but the shit about Batman Begins that I really didn't like is starting to resurface in little ways here, and I have a feeling that it is gonna wear on me as we go through the story. What I am hoping is that the content, like the actual like content that's being told here, will make up for it as we get down the line, because this story does have some interesting stuff in it, so I can't wait to get to that stuff, but as of right now, it's kind of eh. Next episode, we will begin with the Selena chapter, and I will see you for that. Don't forget to like the video on the YouTubes if you like the video in real life. And then subscribe to the channel and watch other videos. And like I said, I will see you next episode. Bye!